Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Tara Palm, Director of Resource Development here at Cristosal. It's good to be together. And to those joining Field Notes for the first time, welcome. Cristosal stands alongside those resisting injustice, defending their rights, seeking truth, and ensuring their voices are heard. Across Central America, we support people demanding justice, confronting corruption, and protecting democracy. Field Notes is Cristosal's space for conversation and reflection. It's a place to consider how power is being exercised, how political decisions shape people's lives, and what it means to continue defending truth, justice, and voice in challenging contexts. As we look back on 2025, many of us have seen how the defense of rights and democracy in Central America has become increasingly intertwined with politics in the United States, shaping policy choices, public narratives, and conditions on the ground. These dynamics are not new, but they are worth examining carefully and honestly. Today's conversation will be led by Noah Bullock, Cristosal's Executive Director. He will be joined by Tommy Vietor, a co-founder of Crooked Media and co-host of Pod Save America and host of Pod Save the World. Previously, Tommy served in the Obama administration. We're so grateful to him for joining us today. Together, they'll reflect on what the past year revealed about the relationship between the U.S. politics and human rights in Central America, and what the relationship means moving forward for U.S. foreign policy, democratic practice, and the human rights movement. Before we begin, a quick note on how the next hour will flow. We'll start with a conversation between Noah and Tommy, followed by time for your questions. Please feel free to add your questions in the chat as they come up. And near the end, Noah will briefly share about Ruth's case, and then we'll close it out. Lastly, as always, super grateful to my colleague Gio, who is behind the scenes here at Field Notes. Thanks, Gio. So with that, thank you again for being here and for the care and attention you bring to these conversations. And Noah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tara, and Tommy, welcome. It's good to see
Thank
you
you
again. I would like to humbly add something to your resume that you are the first friend that I can remember when we lived together. We lived next to each other in Dedham, Massachusetts. One of the nice things about this year was to kind of reconnect with you. Geopolitical forces in the world brought us back together after good sessions of playing Thundercats in the backyard.
Yeah, it was such a funny thing. I mean, first of all, thank you guys for having me. Thank you for the work you're doing. Cristosal is an amazing organization. I think that the media couldn't do its job without you. People like me I couldn't do my job without relying on your work and like the firsthand accounts of the human rights violations that are happening in El Salvador and all over the world. But I was talking to my friend Ricardo Zuniga, just being like, hey, do you know anyone who's an expert on Bukele or Sakot, or could just talk me through this? He was like, I think you lived next to this dude 40 years ago. You're someone you should reach out to. I was like, oh my God. Okay. Yeah. Funny how the world works.
No, well, we're super grateful, Tommy. We know that reality is coming at us, at you like a fire hose right now, and grateful for you making time, and also grateful for the shout outs to Cristosal on the pod throughout the year, and you just kind of personally staying in touch. It's been really meaningful, and we're really grateful to you, Tommy. I think when I reached out to you in December to propose this Field Notes with you, the idea I had was some kind of taking stock of the year, like what just happened to us, kind of do a year in review. And one of the things that I was sort of reflecting on is how Central America is kind of a mirror to the U.S. historically. One of the phrases, I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Danner, but he was one of the journalists that reported on the El Mozote massacre in the 80s when it came out. And he wrote that, the El Mozote massacre, the story of the El Mozote massacre, how it came about, why it had to be denied, stand as a central parable to the Cold War. And I was thinking a little bit about everything that's happened to us this year in some ways is a parable to this time that we're living in. I don't know what we're calling this time. I don't know if it's like down road time or what it would be, but I thought you would be a great person to help us draw that out a little bit, identify those parallels and intersections between what's been happening in the U.S. and what's been happening in El Salvador. And sort of in short, in El Salvador, we were watching the consolidation of an autocracy, while in the U.S., the emergence of an authoritarian political project in the Trump administration. So we're grateful to have you here.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to start taking like a couple of steps back and thinking about history a little bit. One of the things when I came to Central America, maybe because I was studying U.S. foreign policy at the time of the Iraq invasion, like the invasion was shrouded in sort of this exceptional language about the United States projecting democracy in the world and through its invasion of Iraq. And one of the historians that I ended up coming across when I was studying was Walter Lefebvre. I don't know if you're familiar with this guy, but he wrote a book called Inevitable Revolutions. It's about U.S. Foreign policy in Central America. One of the things that he wrote, he published a book in like 1983 and then again in 1990s. And he said that, the United States has invaded Central America more than any other region in the world. I don't know if there's been a lot of invasions since that time, so maybe they don't hold the record in Central America anymore. But, I think looking at the U.S., the way it's acted in Central America is an important place to understand the United States in the world historically. The 1980s was for some a generation of journalists. Many people probably connected today, the Vietnam of their generation. But then it sort of fades out of the spotlight. And so I wanted to ask you kind of when from your experience working in the Obama administration, following political events daily from Pod Save the World, when did El Salvador, Central America come back on your radar as a foreign policy issue?
A great question. I mean, yeah, I think I saw a journalist the other day say that the U.S. has intervened in like 51 or 54 times in Latin America, like some absolutely extraordinary number. And so I guess in some sense, reading the Don Roe Doctrine, which I think we all first sort of started hearing about last December when the administration released their national security strategy, which had a big chunk on the Western Hemisphere, and the quick and dirty on it is Donald Trump announced to everyone that he is the emperor of the Western Hemisphere and that he will not only intervene to advance, U.S. interests wherever he feels like it, but he will also intervene to block out the Chinese or the Russians or any adversary. And I think we saw that in pretty stark terms in this Venezuela operation that just happened. Look, I think when I was in the Obama administration, so much of our time was spent with what we called inbox issues, like things he inherited when we got to office. That included Iraq, that included Afghanistan, that included a global financial crisis. So, I think it's one of those, moments where if we had been able to sort of like sit down blank slate, you would have spent most of your time in the Western Hemisphere, because those are, your closest neighbors, and, Canada and Mexico in particular are some of your most important trading relationships. But, it unfortunately becomes, it gets ranked down a little bit just in terms of the like kind of urgent, glaring priorities. And I think that was to the detriment of the United States and its relationships in the hemisphere. In terms of El Salvador, I went to El Salvador with the Obama administration in like 2010 or 2011, I believe. I have to tell you, I don't remember a ton of the substance of that trip, but it came back on my radar screen in a big way when I started seeing Bukele showing up at these far right conferences in the United States, and also like sort of becoming the premier Bitcoin guy in the international world, and calling himself the world's coolest dictator, and and then learning more about him and his popularity and sort of digging deeper. And so that's when you started to see that this was an individual who had a model that was pretty troubling and that seemed to be successful.
Yeah. Let's get back to that in a moment. I think one of like the first 10 years that I lived in El Salvador, so from like 2005 to 2015, I feel like I used to have to like get out a map and be like, I'm living in El Salvador. It's right here, right? It's south of Mexico. And then the unaccompanied child migrant crisis happened in 2014. That's the first time I remember Central America becoming kind of a political foreign policy issue for the U.S. And at that time, we were working on supporting victims of internal displacement by violence, by gangs. And people were wondering why all these unaccompanied children were ending up on our southern border. And President Obama, I think, called that humanitarian crisis on the border. So I think that's an interesting kind of inflection point, because it sets a new lens from which the United States begins to look at the region, and it's the immigration lens. I think at that time, I remember thinking, like, one of the errors of the past, like during the Cold War, when it was a priority to look at Central America, was sort of the myopic way to see it in the geopolitical Cold War lens, and not, look at the nuance of the region and the actors and what was actually happening. And I think that immigration subsequently, since 2015, has had that similar effect. And then, as you say, all of a sudden, this leader Bukele emerges on the at least regional political scene, if not the geopolitical scene. And so let's like jump back into like this past year. Obviously, 2024, there was an election in the United States. This guy won, President Trump, Donald Trump. I was thinking about this as kind of as the starting point of this period of time, right? Obviously, I remember entering into like 2 days of depression. Like, what are we going to do? And part of that was because President Trump, Bukele actually was like world leader to President Trump, I think, in Yahoo or something like that.
Yeah.
He tweeted out, I'll read you this. He said, I spoke on the phone with real Donald Trump. I congratulated him on his sweeping victory Tuesday. We discussed the strong mandate he received from the American people, the significance of his election holds in the world. We had an interesting conversation about his podcast strategy, the bullet that nearly killed him, the incredible people around him, and the sometimes harmful effects of U.S. aid, George Soros-backed NGOs, and our shared commitment to tackling the challenges ahead. When I saw that, I felt like he was tweeting. He didn't say Cristosal, but he said Cristosal.
Yeah.
And so what pulled me out of kind of this sense of dread was the conclusion that the world changed. And for us to survive as a human rights organization and movement, we have to change. And so we began in November thinking about how we restructure the organization. We began reorganizing, imagining that the United States is no longer going to be a partner for human rights organizations in Central America. I'm curious, like, when you, after the election, I'm pretty sure everybody felt like this was a big change. What were some of the ways that you thought that might play out at that time?
I mean, like you, I sort of fell into some despair for a while. Well, just one quick thought before we get to that. I mean, I like the way you described the kind of myopic, U.S. viewpoint in history for South and Central America. I mean, you're right that for a long time it was the Cold War and just sort of this like ongoing competition with the Russians, and then the Cold War ends, and all of a sudden it's the war on drugs. And I always think that Panama is a really interesting and instructive example of how the U.S. can turn on a dime and just needs to find a new war, because Manuel Noriega was like our paid CIA source and our kind of ace in the hole for getting intelligence about the Cuban government or training the Contras or what have you. And then the Cold War ends, and all of a sudden, all the things the U.S. kind of turned a blind eye to, his murdering of political opponents, the drug running, et cetera, that suddenly becomes a liability for George H.W. Bush. And then in 1989, suddenly we're invading Panama to depose him. So it's interesting the way the world works and how things can shift. I mean, I think in terms of Trump, look, I knew it was going to be bad. I knew he was going to feel more emboldened. I knew that the kind of adults in the room, who I frankly mocked at the time in the first term, were going to be gone, and that it was going to be a bunch of yes people around him. I think I wildly underestimated the degree to which he was going to turn the United States into a kleptocracy that primarily benefits his family and his friends. Like, I didn't see the crypto stuff coming, like selling a meme coin on his name was a new one. I didn't see, the just sort of the degree to which he would run with the Supreme Court decision that says nothing he does in an official capacity could have him prosecuted in the future. And so Yeah, it's been a lot worse than I expected on a lot of levels. The one thing that I think was making me a little hopeful mostly at the end of last year is he hasn't solved any of the problems he promised to solve. All the economic challenges we are facing as a country still exist. There's all the economic inequality. There was jobs numbers out today that were pretty bad. Um, bombing up, bombing a bunch of places in Caracas doesn't solve that. I feared that he's going to become addicted to the response to that kind of action, like looking decisive, looking powerful, looking historic. He got a similar kind of feedback loop after the Iran strikes. And that's what makes me anxious going forward, is that like this is a guy who has recently discovered the Delta Force troops and JSOC and the supremacy of the U.S. military, and is excited about advancing his own personal agenda at gunpoint, and that we might see it again. That's kind of like the thing that is making me the most nervous at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that played out. Donald Trump is, and so is President Bukele. They tend to set new norms through optics and actions, not through doctrine or agreements or treaty bodies, right? And so that's just as important as having an actual plan or a policy, right? I think, like, going back to that time too, like the first thing that President Trump does is create Doge, and we got doged. I remember by January, we got a letter saying that our projects were going to be our U.S. government funded projects were going to be assessed to determine whether they were aligned with America First priorities. And I think by February we got a letter that, and this one really kind of stuck with me. It wasn't like I wasn't expecting it, but it said that we assessed your projects and we're here now canceling them because they no longer align with the United States national interests. Our projects were anti-corruption projects, human rights projects. And so it kind of, it's not like a surprise. It wasn't a surprise. But when it comes, they're saying to you that those things that felt core to at least the previous administration were no longer national interests of the United States. And I think that was like one of the, again, looking at history, the United States has a fraught track record. But I think one of the things that did happen in the last, like really from the Obama administration into the Biden administration, is civil society, who used to look at the United States as colluding with autocrats in the Cold War and complicit in atrocity, now began to look at the United States as a partner in democracy. Civil society organizations across the region, to a fault maybe. But so anyway, that's all reversed. That's all done within weeks. That was one of the things that just struck me.
And look, I'm very aware of the hypocrisy. I'm aware of the history. I understand that even just, like we don't even have to go back to the, the CIA in the 50s and 60s and the 80s. We can talk about Iraq and, how a lot of the talk about human rights or democracy promotion was bullshit and was kind of a fig leaf that allowed for invasions, or the Iraq War, et cetera. I'm also like very self-aware about where the Obama administration fell short on this stuff. You could talk about counterterrorism actions and drone strikes. You could talk about Libya, which was a disaster, well-meaning one, but it was a disaster that's rolled out over decades. However, I do think like there is something kind of refreshingly honest about Donald Trump saying we invaded Venezuela just to take their oil. But I also think like the stories countries tell themselves do really matter. And if the president of a country signals to the entire population overtly that we no longer care about human rights, and it's played out in policy terms by Doge just eradicating USAID, I think that really matters. I think it's incredibly damaging. And I will take a, halting, at times very hypocritical U.S. foreign policy that at least tries to advance these sort of like items in fits and starts over what's happening now, which is just like pure power politics, pay to play, kind of pre-World War I, might is right. And I think it's, it's pretty scary to imagine what 3 years of this will be.
Yeah. And then going back to kind of your first fears about what the Trump administration or second Trump administration should be, the advent of kind of explicit corruption, authoritarian presidency, these are things that from the sort of the American exceptional mindset are patterns that you see in the third world, in the global south, right? And now we're kind of looking at the global south or El Salvador itself as a kind of a direct reflection of political realities in the U.S. Let's jump to like I think for us, sort of that first big impact was the cut of U.S. assistance, and I think our organization felt. I remember wondering, it wasn't just the financial assistance that we lost; it was also the political support. However feckless the Biden administration was in terms of checking Bukele's worst sort of authoritarian instincts, I think that they did do a good job of protecting civic space. And when we saw that tweet from President Bukele, I thought, I don't know how long El Salvador will be a safe place for me, my family, and our organization. And then the SICOT deal happens. And I think that was like kind of, it caught me by surprise a little bit. Migrants were clearly part of sort of the Trump's rhetoric about constructing the image of an internal enemy. But then to use SICOT as an explicit tool in a campaign of terror against migrants, it was shocking to me. But from our standpoint, shocking because the United States is contracting the prison system that we have investigated and demonstrated that is responsible for mass and systematic human rights abuses we consider crimes against humanity. Tens of thousands of people disappeared into prisons, tortured, hundreds of killings, and then the United States hires that prison as a policy tool. What were that's I think when you and I started talking, right? When the SICOT deal happened, and what were kind of your reactions?
I mean, I think similar to you, it's like what's the cliche, shocking but not surprising. Like I think we all should be shocked that the U.S. would render hundreds of men and tried to send a bunch of women from Venezuela to a prison in El Salvador to be tortured under the thinnest of pretexts. I mean, the thing that will always stick with me was the video. I mean, Bukele, right, because he's such a terrible human being and a marketing expert, to the extent that he has any expertise, started putting out these videos from that evening, these hype videos of the detention of these individuals, and then he had journalists embedded. So you're immediately deluged with stories about, Andre Hernandez Romero is one name that sticks with me, who is this makeup artist, this Venezuelan makeup artist who left Venezuela, came to the US because he faced persecution because he was gay. And he was sent to this torture prison because he had tattoos, and he's weeping for his mother as they're shaving his head and beating him. And I just remember kind of lying in bed that night, and when you sort of like you're empathizing a little too hard, you can imagine yourself physically in that man's shoes and just the hell and the nightmare and sort of the reality that he is in. Because frankly, I worry that they were never going to get out at that point. I mean, it didn't seem like there was going to be a path. Thank God they eventually did. But I thought it was a stunning development in signal that I think told us everything we needed to know about the extent of the cruelty we were going to see from this administration, which has extended just to this week, where a woman is shot in the face by an ICE officer in Minnesota, and rather than take a minute and say we're going to investigate what happened, Kristi Noem calls this mother of three a domestic terrorist, and the vice president of the United States calls her a deranged leftist and argues that she had it coming, essentially. And I think that is unbelievably chilling, right? I mean, that's sort of this kind of thing you'd expect out of Putin's Russia, which is that they can kill you and then call you a terrorist and then cover up any investigation. And that's kind of where we are right now.
Yeah, I see that exact same kind of direct path from SICOT to what happened in Minneapolis. The sense that I had was that it was almost like the Trump administration, in their theater of cruelty that is their immigration policy, rented out SICOT as a prop, as a stage for it. It was telling that Kristi Noem gave her press conference in front of a cell that was clearly old members of the Mara Salvatrucha who were transferred from other prisons. These were not the Venezuelan migrants, but the optics of people with the gangs tattooed on their faces and their chests reinforced this narrative that immigrants are an internal enemy in the United States.
Yep.
And sort of the whole stage was to link immigrants to a terror prison, to a group of people in the United States who shouldn't be protected by law, that they demonstrably did that in the disappearance of them to the Secaucus. And once you create that group of people, that category of people that aren't protected by rights, it just becomes expansive. And I think that that's what we saw in Minneapolis today. Even people who oppose the law enforcement agents that are cracking down against this internal enemy are therefore enemies themselves. And I think we hear that language in the last week too, after the Venezuela stuff. You hear this conflation. It's like migrants, gang members, terrorists, narco-terrorists, extremists. And so it's that old poem about first they came for the labor unions. The updated version and language is that. So I agree with you.
And it's completely manufactured, right? I mean, for the administration in 2020, they released an indictment of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. In that indictment, they referred to him 32 times, I believe, as the head of a cartel called Cartel de las Soles. But anyone who is an expert in Venezuela can tell you that that's not a real thing. It's a slang term made up by journalists to describe basically corrupt officials, like the generals who have suns on their uniforms. And now they use that language from that indictment to designate Cartel de las Soles as a terrorist organization by the Treasury Department and the State Department, and that has been used to justify the extrajudicial murder of men in boats off the coast of Venezuela or in the Pacific who are alleged to be drug traffickers. It is telling, though, that when they picked up Maduro, brought him to New York, and indicted him a second time, they yanked that description of Cartel de las Soles and they went with the reality, which is basically that it's just a term for a pervasive culture of corruption. But they are just manufacturing both this legal and communications precedent to declare whole classes of people enemies. And the end game of that process is them saying that they are allowed to kill them or to kill you if you try to defend those people. It is as chilling as it gets.
Yeah. And I also think if President Trump envies in some ways President Bukele, it's this absolute power that he has as a president to decide who are internal enemies and who has rights and who doesn't, and do whatever he wants with them. That is I think that's the fundamental. If we're talking about the dictator's handbook here, it's like creating that narrative, that collective belief is then about an internal enemy, a group that's a threat that shouldn't be protected, is a way of opening up the gates to that unchecked presidential power to do whatever you want to whoever you want. And in our reality, that came really close to home when they arrested our colleague Ruth Lopez, disappeared her into prisons with no due process. The very justifications of this power is a security threat that's so great that the president needs unique and extraordinary powers to protect the people, is now used in El Salvador to persecute human rights defenders and exercise repressive control. I think that's like that's part of that dialogue. I think, Anne Applebaum wrote the book Autocracy Inc., right, where she says that autocrats around the world collude with each other to support each other, to undermine a rules-based system. And I think it's just been, the Secaucus deal is a parable of how the Trump administration colludes with the Bukele administration to construct optics, narratives, extend the limits of presidential power, and normalize abuse.
And I think unfortunately, there is. Sorry, I keep shifting over because the sun is moving here in Los Angeles. There is this infrastructure that is pretty well established on the far right in the United States. There's an organization called CPAC that has been meeting, several times a year for like a couple decades now, and that connective tissue and organization has become like a really critical node for right-wing autocrats around the world, right? I mean, I think that they pretty quickly spun out CPAC Hungary. I know that, Bukele has been a frequent guest at CPAC events. Javier Milei down in Argentina is there. And like, you can see, like, these are Trump's buddies. Like, these are the people he will do favors for. He offered Argentina a $40 billion bank bailout. in advance of their elections, right? I mean, he has been trying to intervene and pick winners and losers in elections in Honduras, and then pardons their corrupt narco trafficking former president. So yes, they trade best practices, they coordinate their activities, and I think on the left we need to figure out ways to do that better.
Yeah, and I think it again, going back to this idea of a parallel, or a parable, the Sikkot deal is the emblematic deal of transactional diplomacy as Trump pursues it. A diplomacy devoid of transparency, accountability, in which personal and criminal interests get conflated with national interests. I think the Bukele brothers tried to negotiate a discount on detaining the migrants in exchange for returning members of the Mara Salvatrucha on trial in the Southern District of New York, so that they'll give testimony about their partnership with his regime, right? So this is kind of like, I think, again, emblematic of a new world system that the Trumps of the world are trying to put together, and they need other autocrats to do it, because transparent democratic governments wouldn't allow for these types of transactions to happen. I think that might explain a lot of why they feel comfortable with Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela.
Yeah. No, I think they're far more comfortable with autocracy, with that system. I think you're right that Trump is envious of it. I mean, he said as much repeatedly about Xi Jinping. I'm sure, I'm sure every president has been dealing with terrible press or fights with Congress and thought, boy, that autocracy system sounds kind of fun right now, but only Trump is actually meant to that, and this would put that into action. It's quite troubling.
We have a quick clip of sort of to maybe close out this idea of
Sure.
the Trump Bukele collusion in chapter Sucursal de Autocracy Inc. When Bukele visited the White House, he said to Trump, "Hey, Gio, why don't you put the video up? It's probably better just to hear it from them both."
Sometimes they say that we imprison thousands. I like to say that we actually liberated millions. So,
That's very good. Who gave him that line? Do you think I can use that?
Yes.
An American president saying, that's great to imprison thousands. I'd like to do that too.
Yeah, I love the great messaging about your state of exception and suspension of human rights, and it's just horrible. It's horrible. Due process.
So let's jump into some of the consequences in this parable of these patterns that we see. Our organization, I think, like I mentioned, when people began to ask questions about what's behind this prison system, for us, sadly, the suffering of the Venezuelans put a spotlight on a prison system that we had been denouncing for several years. And we had a set of data that was demonstrative of systematic and mass human rights violations. But then we suffered in May, the consequences of a repressive crackdown against human rights. And I think this becomes something else that I think when I'm curious to hear your perspective of this, but one of the signs of the times is also the assumption that people can dissent in front of a moral crisis. And do that without consequences is no longer a guaranteed assumption. The Cristosal, our organization, our friends, human rights defenders in El Salvador, are now suffering prison and exile because we denounce torture. And so I'd be interested to hear. I know when you also reached out to me while this was going on, and some of this was in the headlines. We're a tiny human rights organization. What was kind of striking? Why was this a news story that when we were kicked out of El Salvador?
I think, well, look, I genuinely struggled with how to think about this, because I don't live in El Salvador. I'm a white guy in LA living a totally different privileged existence, right? And I struggled with how to think about what it would be like to live in El Salvador and deal with just unimaginable levels of violence, and then have someone like Bukele come in and take actions that are clearly not constitutional, that suspends, human rights and due process. But then, as the average citizen, maybe you feel safer. And I think the fact that you guys had such clear data on the reality of those detentions, who was getting picked up, the volume, the scale, the treatment of individuals once they were picked up, I think helped me see quite clearly the immorality of the process and what was happening. And then I think, there is declaring NGOs, enemies of the state and kicking them out. That is just sort of like autocrat 101. And I think if there was any question about whether Bukele was just a guy trying to fight crime, just a guy trying to modernize his country, bring investment down through all these Bitcoin idiots, that was kind of pushed away when you guys were, threatened, arrested, and pushed out of the country. So I think, the courage and commitment and bravery shown by you and your team, I think helps elucidate a story that might seem very opaque to people in the United States who don't have any experience on the ground. And that's why it was really meaningful and mattered, and people cared when they saw the crackdown, essentially.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think also that's one of the challenges in doing human rights advocacy when there's a security narrative in place.
Yeah.
He disappeared 90,000 people, probably at the time in May, it was around 80,000 people in the prisons with no due process. And it was very difficult for anyone to care about it because there was this trade-off thing, right? That then somehow there's a security outcome, so we can't question it. But once they began to arrest human rights defenders, I think your point is right on. It was clarifying of the nature of the repressive regime that was put into place under the guise of a security strategy.
Yeah. Then you're like, oh, that's Putin, right? It's easier for people like me to be like, oh, okay, seen this before. That's a Putin playbook. This is obvious.
Yeah. And I think there are other cases like the disappearance and torture and killing of Alejandro Mason. It's a case that we represented. It's one of Bukele's security advisors who denounced corruption and then, in a Putin style, was basically executed in prison. And then, and at the national level, Ruth, why Ruth? Who was Ruth? People said to us that when they captured Ruth, it felt like they could capture anybody. And Ruth was detained and continues to be in detention as a message to the whole society. The dissent won't be tolerated. And so I think, again, you're right on. It's authoritarianism 101. I think one of the things, though, that Ruth's capture was, we reached 100 million individual accounts worldwide, the news of Ruth's detention. Like something, it said something to the world about, again, maybe this parable thing, but I think when they captured Ruth, that was a kind of a point of no return for the public image of Bukele.
Yeah, I hope so. It should be. I mean, for what it's worth, it does feel like Trump is trying to send similar messages here. It has been for a while. I mean, it started with foreign students who dared to suggest that the war in Gaza wasn't going perfectly, or that maybe the U.S. shouldn't be sending weapons to the Israelis to indiscriminately bomb tents in the Gaza Strip, right? I mean, those people who put their names on op-eds were being locked up and thrown in prison for months at a time, missing the birth of their kids. I mean, just horrifying stuff. And then more recently, even members of Congress who stated something factual and true and obvious, which is that members of the U.S. military should not have an obligation to not follow unlawful orders. Trump has asked his Department of Defense to find ways to punish those individuals, including elected U.S. senators. Right. Mark Kelly, former astronaut, might be demoted for daring to say that you shouldn't kill someone without authorization. So yeah, it's we feel it here too.
Yeah, and I mentioned before, one of the principal programmatic activities of Cristosal in the past has been protecting victims of gang violence. We're never denied that. One of the things that I thought about when we started becoming the targets of repression is our organization, individuals, citizens living there, we know the fear of being threatened by a criminal organization like gangs. But when we begin to feel the threat of an authoritarian state against you, the power of the state against you, it's a different level of terror. And I think one of the things that motivates us is sort of this idea, that while we're seeing these setbacks happening in real time, we have to keep pushing back based on the hope that our children will be free to dissent, to denounce torture without having to choose between exile and prison.
Yeah.
I think like going back 20 years when I came to El Salvador, I don't think that I thought that would be the challenge facing the human in my generation. I thought we would be building on progress, but in the end, I think we're trying to hold the norms, hold the minimums, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I think, Tommy, we're going to jump to questions now.
Let's do it.
I wanted to go deep dive a little bit more into U.S. foreign policy and things in Venezuela, but maybe we'll have to save that one for another episode.
Sure.
Let's give
Anytime.
people a chance to ask questions.
Thanks, Tommy and Noah. This has been a great discussion. So I'm looking at the chat, the questions in the chat. Amy's wondering if there are any updates on vote. Any new updates? Wondering of the chances of people being released. Just don't know if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, the case of Ruth, one of the challenges that we have about speaking about her trial is that it has been declared secret. She's not being given a public trial, she's being tried in secret. But what we can say is that in December, she should have had her first hearing in a court. And the Attorney General requested the judge overseeing the case to extend her pretrial detention for another 6 months. And so she didn't get her first hearing. She continues to be in prison in the El Salco prison complex with little to no access to the outside. I think one of the things that we're concerned about is we see the use of pretrial detention as a way of sort of giving punishment without even having to have a trial. We have people in the state of exception will be in prison for 7 years before they get tried en masse, right? We've seen multiple political prisoners who spend 3-5 years in prison before they're ever even arraigned formally. So this is kind of a way that they've manipulated the justice system to just punish anybody without even needing to have a real case against them. So we're hoping that the continued international support for Ruth is her best asset. We did have some bittersweet news about 2 other human rights defenders who were released at the end of last year, Alejandro and Jose Angel. They accepted, they made a plea deal basically, and accepted that one of the charges in exchange for freedom. Their case is way different than Ruth because they were arrested as a result of a protest in which the military police the whole thing was on video, kind of like the Minneapolis thing. Clearly the military police were the aggressors. And facing the prospect of an indefinite time in prison and the conditions in the prison, Jose and Alejandro decided to take this option and be released. So we're happy for their freedom.
Yeah. Ruth is asking, what about Bezos telling Washington Post editorial team they could not endorse Kamala? Any reflections from either of you?
I mean, I think it's just one example of a widespread capitulation by, powerful figures in business and media that is quite depressing. I never thought the press was going to save us, right? I mean, we have to save ourselves as citizens and through the political process. But, Jeff Bezos didn't want a bunch of contracts he had with the U.S. government to get killed. So suddenly owning the Washington Post became an inconvenience. And so I think that was a signal that he was ready to shut down what would certainly be a critical editorial, even if electorally it would have been meaningless. It was more just kind of like a scalp, I think, for Trump on the wall. I think you've seen similar things over at CBS News where they're, 60 Minutes is spiking pieces on Tecot and El Salvador. And there's new leadership there that is widely perceived as being brought in to satiate Trump. You've seen law firms in the U.S. capitulate to Trump and cut deals to provide him services. You've seen, the big tech platforms almost giddy at him coming in because they can no longer pretend to care about, equity and inclusion and, things they view as not core to their bottom line. And as they cut giant bribe checks to build his ballroom or, library or whatever it is. So, yeah, I think it was an early signal about the path we're going to go down, which is just total capitulation by the business world.
Yeah. I think that's a page out of the dictator's handbook here. We have this year, dozens of journalists from El Salvador were forced into exile. And all of the independent television shows, news shows in El Salvador have been shut down. But also, like what Tommy's saying too, is I think one of the surprising things as we watched, we used to call it a process for dictatorship, right? Like before it was fully one. And just how few champions there are, how few democratic heroes there are, because as there becomes real cost to resisting a regime and unlikely positive outcomes, business people put that on the scale and decide to survive through other means. And that is one of the challenges as a regime consolidates power. The likely positive outcomes for resisting are low, and the consequences for resisting are almost guaranteed.
Yeah. Okay, from Alexander, what are your views on path going forward? So maybe we can talk about 2026. How can we create pressure in the U.S. for Ruth and others' liberation, or any human rights work in general? Any reflections from either of you going forward?
You want to take a hack at that, Tommy?
Sure. I think, look, I think the scariest part of this whole thing is that we've only got almost 1 year of Trump under our belts, and we got 3 more. And it is what it is. I just don't imagine a impeachment scenario being likely to play out. So we have to work with the tools we have. And I think I'm very, very focused on the 2026 midterms. I think Democrats have a really good chance at winning back the House. The Senate map is going to be a little bit harder, but we could do it. We have to win some tough races. It would involve winning like statewide races in places like Iowa, which have gone very Trumpy over the last 10 years. But it's doable. But the House is very, very doable. And I think like that is kind of the first, the first nail in the coffin of him being a lame duck. Now, he will still have a ton of authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to conduct foreign policy. He will still do heinous things. I do not think that human rights will be a part of his agenda until he is gone. But I think we have an opportunity as citizens to organize and, sort of let him know that his views are unpopular and this path is unpopular, and that we actually want the story of America to be one that cares about these things. And 2, there will be a big, raucous Democratic presidential primary starting, well, now really, but the day after the 2026 elections, it'll really kick up. And I think that's another opportunity to push candidates on how are you going to rebuild USAID? Like, obviously, you're not going to just run it back the way it was, but how will you make it different and better going forward? How will you reprioritize human rights and get us out of this kind of kleptocratic, Donroe doctrine foreign policy? So there will be a lot of opportunity to move past Donald Trump. There's going to be some choppy waters until then, but I'm hopeful we can get there.
Yeah, similar reflection. As institutions in El Salvador were co-opted by the regime, institutions in a democracy set up to protect people. We look at the international human rights system of the Second World War. They created international institutions to protect people. They've all been imperfect. They've all failed to protect people. But as they collapse and are gone, you realize that the only thing left to protect people is solidarity among people, and organizing and support. In some ways, I think that we are part of a big movement of people, linking with the context that Tommy's talking about, to America. who recognize that the world has changed, that it's not going to ever go back to how it was, but that this vision that autocrats like and President Trump put forward for the future is not the future and can't be the future. And we have to support each other in doing that. I think one of the challenges in confronting and resisting these authoritarian systems is that we end up defending institutions that people don't really believe in anymore. And we end up look like we're defending the status quo, and these guys who are kind of promising a return to like gunboat diplomacy look like they're the modern ones. And so I think that when we denounce these political movements, autocratic political movements, we need to also be doing it with a vision of radical reform of the institutions that maybe didn't deliver the way they should have in the past. And so I think that has to be kind of the mandate among people: solidarity, support, denounce what's wrong, but also be conscious about building a vision about how things could be better. That's one of the traps for human rights organizations, is we get stuck talking about torture. And we forget to remind people that human rights are one of the most romantic visions of a better world that human beings have ever had. So I think we need to embrace that as well.
Thanks for those reflections and kind of looking forward. Bonnie is looking, Tommy being in LA, asking the question, what is the general feeling among Salvadoran immigrants in Los Angeles right now? Any thoughts about that?
I gotta be honest, I don't think I have my finger on the pulse of kind of the Salvadorian diaspora here right now. I think that the general feeling among like most immigrants from Central and South America is fear, a pervasive fear that you could get picked up by ICE, documented or not, that you could get racially profiled, that you could get harassed. There's every other week there's some thing that goes viral. It's like, oh, the group of nannies were arrested in a park, or like some horrible thing happens, and it has just led people to not lead their lives, or to lead like abridged versions of their lives where they don't see family and friends and go out and are scared to go to work. And so like that is the really awful thing that you feel in Los Angeles and have since the very beginning. And it's less of like a shock to the system anymore, but like that fear is not going away. Those are videos of people getting arrested at a Home Depot parking lot. Like everyone just assumes that is going to happen again and again and again. And they also rightly assume that on some level, what happened in Minnesota is what Stephen Miller and the White House want. They want confrontations to justify further crackdowns. And that is like the hard thing to navigate as a citizen, which is you want to protest, you want to push back. You don't want to have to fear for your life in the process, but also you don't want to create some sort of fodder for, these monsters. So like that's, I think, the thing people are constantly balancing.
Yeah. Well, as we are, a few minutes away from time, I wanted to give either of you a chance, or one last question, Noah, if you had, that you wanted to, give to Tommy, or any other reflections, either of you, before we close. So we just have a few more minutes. Any last questions or thoughts from either of you?
No, just thank you, Tommy, again for all your support and for being with us today, and hope we can continue to be in conversation.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thanks to everyone who tuned in for this and is watching or listening or supporting Cristosal. It is enormously important in this moment when the USAID is gutting funding for organizations that are doing absolutely critical human rights groups, that we as citizens step up with our love and our labor, and if we can, our financial support. So the fact that you would do that, donate to Cristosal or support the organization in any way, even just through solidarity, is really, really meaningful. And as I say, like, I'm a person who sits in a studio and talks about these things for a living. I realize how divorced from like the risk and the harm I am in that role. And so that's why, for me, I mean, it's so unbelievably valuable to be able to talk to people like, or folks in the organization about the work you are doing, the data you've collected, which I know comes at great risk. And so basically just thank you, like truly, you guys are heroes. You're doing heroic work. Everyone should just sort of know that and realize that you're supporting something incredibly important and righteous and just. And, thank you for doing it.
Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you, Tommy, for those, I don't know, those supportive and words of solidarity. It really means a lot. So thank you. As we close, again, thank you to Noah and Tommy for this conversation. Thanks to everybody here in this space and people who will be watching it afterwards. Thank you for being here and the questions you shared. At Cristosal, we stand alongside those resisting injustice, defending truth and justice and voice. And conversations like these matter because they remind us that none of this work happens alone. I think that the strong word of solidarity among the people has been really resonant, and you are a part of that movement that insists on justice when it is denied, truth when it is hidden, and voice when silence is imposed. It is a shared effort rooted in accountability, courage, and responsibility to one another. So thank you for being here. We will be sharing a recording of this Field Notes conversation soon, so please forward it on as you see it come into your inbox. And we hope you'll stay connected. So thank you again for your solidarity, your trust, and for carrying this work forward with us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.